Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started this morning. Sorry I keep being out. I want to thank Caleb for filling in kind of last minute for me last week. Shelby's aunt passed away very unexpectedly on Wednesday, and so we were kind of in a figure everything out mode, and so I texted around and Caleb was able to cover for me, so I appreciate that. But in theory, I'm not going to be gone any more Sundays, but we'll see if that holds true. We're going to be in lesson 8, which covers First Kings chapter 2, if you want to be turning over there. Lesson 8 in First Kings chapter 2. And so kind of last week, I think you all covered, David announcing that Solomon is going to be the king. So we've kind of worked through at least all the turmoil up to this point of Absalom trying to take over as king, and then drawing a blank, his other son that tried to take over as king. And now we're to the point where it's like, okay, we're going to establish Solomon as the actual king. And this is the transition point where David dies, and we move on to looking at Solomon's life kind of in our book as well. But before we even get started into that, I wanted to think a little bit about what are some challenges that we even see today when there's a leadership change. Because if you think about this, for God's children here, the nation of Israel, like, this is only the second handoff, right? And a lot of times companies, if you think about companies today, they really, or as far as kings go, it was the second handoff. But like, if you think about companies today, they tend to struggle when like it's been the same CEO for the whole time they've been a company, and that person like steps down or passes on or whatever. A lot of companies struggle with that transition. So we have Saul to David, which was not, not the cleanest of transitions, right? And then you have David to Solomon, which at this point is a little bit cleaner, but there's been all this turmoil. So what are some things that you think, before we get into this, that might be challenging of like handing over the reins, either from like what you've experienced in your life or just thinking about what we've studied so far? Yeah.
Maybe unfinished business that may not get covered or taken care of, so it gets dropped and people get lost in the process.
Right. Yeah, that's a big one, right? Because when you're in charge, or even just in charge of your own workload, oftentimes there's things that you're keeping track of in your head that you're like, I want to make sure this gets done, but you haven't taken the time to write it down or like pass it on or make sure someone else is equipped to handle it. And those things can be very challenging. Yeah, Jesse?
I think with any change, wherever it is, there's always somebody that's happy about it and somebody that's not happy about it. And so you have always that factor that's in there.
Yeah, and that's like we see that throughout the story. Yeah.
Who do you keep on payroll and who do you fire?
Right. Like we even the past few weeks we've been looking at, like, as David ended the conflict with Absalom, like who he kept on versus who he put in charge, and then you're going to continue to have that point. And then I thought it would also be interesting for us to take a minute or two to think, then when we think about the church today, what are the, like, we face challenges ourselves in like appointing elders for the first time and like going through leadership transitions. What are some things either you all have experienced or you think could come up in the church that could be specifically challenging spiritually as leaders change? Anything different than what we've already mentioned? Yeah.
I think we had a mutual acquaintance through Jerry Barber. So he's like in his 80s now, barefoot marathon runner, but he does interim ministry.
Yeah.
So he'll go between one preacher to another. So I think his theory is, if a preacher's been there for 20 plus years, everybody's going to hate the new guy.
Yep.
So let me come in for 18 months and they can hate me, and then get off on the right start with the new guy.
Well, yeah, and that brings up a lot of things that come to mind for me of like, when the new guy comes along, you're always comparing him to the old guy, right? You're like, oh, you don't do this the same way, or you don't do this as good as they did, or even if it's not good versus bad, right? It's just like, oh, this is different, and like people handle things differently. So I think that happens a lot with preachers. I think that can happen with elderships as well. As far as like if somebody new is appointed to be an elder and like things are handled like slightly differently, not scripturally wrong, right? But like just different thoughts and different perspectives on things. I think that can be challenging as well. I think every congregation I've been a part of, but this one I've seen like a preacher transition, where there was someone who'd been preaching for a long time at the congregation, like Baxter's mentioning, and then when the new person comes in, it is a rough transition, just because of how many things the guy that's heading out or whatever happened, took care of or whatever. So I think those are all good things to keep in mind. Yeah, Kayla.
I think sometimes the congregation has expectations without checking in with the person on what they're doing, like what classes they might want to teach or what their talents are.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's gonna apply as we get into the lesson today too. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, another thing that happens if you've had a preacher for a long, long time, the people become real close to him personally.
Yep.
Becomes like a person in your life, and so then all of a sudden to see that go, it'd be like when one of your kids goes off to the military or something like that. You're missing this person, and that's where you build up these expectations for the new guy. Could he match up to that feeling?
Right, and the guy who's moving on has had years and years to build those relationships, right? So it's not, you completely understand it's our human nature that you expect to have the same relationship with the next guy, but it's unreasonable to think that's going to happen, overnight, right? Like it takes time. So I think that's a good thing for us to think about as we study about Solomon taking over, is like, how can we apply this to ourselves, and like what would make transitions easier, even if we're not the one transitioning in a leadership role, the things that we can keep in mind, that might be tough for that person, or the things that we can do to ease transition for the people that we're leading if we are in that leadership position. So anyway, I thought those were some good things for us to keep in mind as we go through the lesson today. The first passage we're going to read is 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 9. If somebody wants to read that for me. 1 Kings 2, chapter 1 through 9. Or verse 1 through 9.
Now the days of David drew near that he should die, and he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be strong, therefore, and prove yourself a man. And keep the charge of the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his judgments, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. That the Lord may fulfill his word, which he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons take heed to their way, to walk before me in truth with all their heart and with all their soul, he said, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Moreover, you know also what Joab the son of Zeruiah did to me, and what he did to the two commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner the son of Ner, and Amasa the son of Jether, whom he killed. And he shed the blood of war in peacetime, and put the blood of war on his belt that was around his waist, and on his sandals that were on his feet. Therefore do according to your wisdom, and do not let his gray hair go down to the grave in peace. But show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table. For so they came to me when I fled from Absalom to your brother. Fled from Absalom your brother. And see, you have with you Shemiah the son of Gera, a Benjamite from Bahurim, who cursed me with a malicious curse in the day when I went to Mahanaim. But you came down to meet me at the Jordan, and I swore to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put you to death with the sword. Now therefore, do not hold him guiltless, for you are a wise man, and know what you ought to do to him. But bring his gray hair down to the grave with blood.
Thank you. I learned from a couple weeks ago to make sure I'll just have somebody else read all the tough names. So I appreciate that. So I think Baxter kind of even touched on this with some of his comments, is like, as David is getting ready for this transition, we see that, one, he's trying, clearly it's not just these statements he's making, like he's hopefully prepared Solomon through actions and experience and things before this, but he's kind of summarizing what a transition plan would look like. First of all, I think in verse 1, we kind of see that it's implied that like David recognizes that his time is coming nigh, right? Like he recognizes the need for this transition, which I think you all even talked about last week, as far as like it's been a struggle for David throughout his life to like do the things that need to be done immediately at the time that they need to be done, right? But I think at this point he's recognizing that he's about to die, and so he is trying to impart as much wisdom and give as much guidance to Solomon as he can before that happens, so that we can avoid some of those things we mentioned where it's like, oh, I have this list of things I need to do, I didn't get them done, and the new guy doesn't know what to do. So I think we see that in verses 1 and 2. And I think it's really interesting, like the order that David talks about these things, because when we look at like verses 2 through 4, what is he focusing on making sure that Solomon is set up for here? Like what is he telling him to focus on in these next couple verses? God, right? Like he's supposed to walk with the Lord. What is the most important thing for a leader of God's people that we see throughout the Bible, whether it's Moses or Joshua or any of the leaders that we see in the Old or the New Testament? Like, what is the most important thing that they are supposed to do to be successful? They're supposed to talk to God. They're supposed to listen to him. They're supposed to come to him when they have problems, right? And like so many of the problems throughout the Old and the New Testament are because leaders were like, you know what, I can handle this myself, or I can make this decision, right? And they don't go and consult God. And so like David has made many of those mistakes himself. Solomon will go on to make some mistakes himself, but he's trying to like convey the message that it's important to walk with the Lord. It's important to keep his commandments and statutes. So I think that that's very important for us to remember today as well. Whether we're in a leadership position or not, it is important for us to keep God at the front of our minds and make sure that we are serving him and walking in his ways, whatever we do. Then, and that's not just for Solomon, right? We've talked about for many weeks that it's important to be a good example and like keep your household in check, because that led to so many of David's problems, right? Like, his kids would do something, he wouldn't, immediately discipline them or do what needed to be done, and most of them ended up dying because of him not doing what he needed to do. They had committed things they shouldn't have as well, so it wasn't completely on David, but like he could have hopefully prevented a lot of those things. So I think this is also saying to Solomon, like, you need to line this up for yourself, and you need to line this up for your kids, and like make sure that everybody is following the Lord and listening to what he says. So we have that kind of first chunk of what he's supposed to keep in mind, and then we get into like that list of things that David is like, hey, here's the things that you need to take care of or keep in mind as this transition happens. So we have Joab, right, and he's been there's a lot that's gone on with Joab, in the past couple of weeks that we've studied. We see here in verse 5, it says, "Moreover, you also know that what Joab, the son of Zeruiah, did to me, how he dealt with the two commanders of the armies of Israel, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, the son of Jether, whom he killed, avenging in the time of peace for blood that had been shed in war, and putting his blood of war on the belt around his waist and on the sandals of his feet." And so we see all the things that, like, a summary of the things that Joab has done, and David's telling him, like, use your wisdom and use your judgment, but don't let him go away in peace. And so Solomon's definitely going to need to keep an eye on him. And then we have Barzillai, the Gileadite, who had helped David out when he was running from Absalom. So David says, Solomon, you need to take care of this guy. You need to make sure to repay him for the good that he's done. And then we also have Shimei mentioned that we've studied the past couple weeks. And I thought this one was very interesting because if we remember 2 weeks ago, we studied that David said, I will not put you to death by the sword. And that's repeated in verse 8 here. But he says he's not guiltless. You're a wise man, and you'll figure out what you need to do. And then later on, we'll get to how Solomon actually does end up killing him. He takes care of him in kind of a clever way. But I think we've got all these things as references of like the different things that David wanted Solomon to do, kind of that point Baxter made earlier of like, these are things that need to get taken care of, and I want to make sure you have the details to take care of correctly. What do you think some of the challenges for Solomon to take care of some of these things might be, though? I know I talked a lot about the things he's going to do, but like some of these men he may have to go on to kill. What would be the challenge of that as like a new leader who might not have the direct relationships with them? Like, yeah.
Well, technically, they're not really his problem. They
Oh,
should have been already dealt with. So it's difficult to clean up somebody else's mess.
Right.
Nobody's happy when you do that.
Yeah. That's a really good point. Like, so Solomon might feel some of that, right? Where he's like, why am I having to deal with these things? And this is like, could be like, I would view this as tough, right? Like if I was moving into this position, like you're talking about people's lives here. We know what they've done, right? And we know what the Bible has said that is supposed to happen to them, but that doesn't necessarily make it easy to say, like, I need to like exile these people or I need to kill these people or whatever. So I think that as we continue through this, just keeping in mind that Solomon may have some of these thoughts, what we'll see today is that he actually acts a lot quicker than David does in a lot of these instances. But I think we should keep in mind that, at least, if I'm thinking about me personally, this isn't all going to be like easy tasks to carry out just because David says, here's what you need to do, right? That doesn't make it necessarily an easy process. So that's definitely stuff to keep in mind as we go through our study today. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next section?
I think it's interesting that he didn't mention what Joab did to Absalom.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, you have to know that was basically the biggest thing.
Right. Yeah, and it's like we can probably hypothesize about like why he doesn't bring that up, like if David feels guilt over it, or he knows that like Solomon is not, like that was Solomon's brother, right? Like, and so who, we don't know for sure why he doesn't bring it up, but it is interesting. Any other?
I think it's interesting, David said, I won't put you to death with the sword.
Yeah.
And so then he tells Solomon, take care of it, do whatever,
Right.
But I won't put you to death with the sword. So.
Right. Yeah, it's one of those like where Shimei is like, oh, David told me this, I'm good to go now, and it's like, yeah, probably not. But anyway, yeah, we'll look at that I think here in a bit later today if we get to it. Any other thoughts? All right, can somebody read verses 10 through 12 for me of chapter 2?
Then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. The days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years. 7 years he reigned in Hebron, and 33 years he reigned in Jerusalem. And Solomon sat on the throne of his father, David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established.
All right, thank you. So I thought for this kind of short little passage here, we could take a second, and we've done this pause a little bit before, but I wanted to focus more on the positive things that David has done in his life. What are some of the things that like David has accomplished, even starting from when he was, a young child or teenager, that like Solomon is going to have to like try to live up to? What are things that come to mind when you think of good things that David has done in his life? Kill Goliath. Yep, that's a big one. I don't know that Solomon's going to be able to pull off something exactly like that. What else has David accomplished? What kind of king was he known as?
Warrior.
He was a warrior, right? Like he was powerful military leader, and like that's even why God tells him he's not going to be able to build a temple, right? Is because like you shed blood, and like that's why Solomon is going to get to do that. So I think that's something we can keep in mind too as we like compare and contrast David and Solomon as we go through the coming weeks. Is there's been a lot of great things that David has done, but to the points we discussed at the start of class, Solomon is going to accomplish different things that are also great, but for people who might be looking for one specific thing or another, they might be disappointed or pleased. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. Um, and then like verse 12 is interesting too, because it calls out, so Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. And I think this is interesting because it's an important point to make, because up till this point, right, we've had at least 2 attempts to take the throne by force, right, that wasn't part of God's plan. And so all the things that you all talked about last week and then on to like this transition period has been really important to like actually establish Solomon's the king, like let's squash all these like uprisings and things, and let's move on as a nation and heal and do the things that we need to do for God. So I think that that's an interesting point that comes up here, and will lead hopefully to some of the stability that we see in Solomon's rule, because there's not all this infighting among the siblings and things like that. So that was a short section in the book, but I thought important to reflect on the life of David. Any other thoughts there before we move on to the last chunk?
Building the temple and gathering the materials and so forth that he did, the planning ahead for
Right.
that.
Yeah, and that made it a lot easier, that all those materials were there. And I think that's another thing, that we can even look at as members of the church here, right? Like, what are we doing to set up success for future generations, right? What are we putting in place to make it easier for them? Because it can be, it's a lot easier for us if we just focus on what's going to make our life good, right? Like, or what's going to make life easier for us. And, as you get towards the end of your life, it may be easier to be focusing on like all the challenging things you'll face there, rather than like, what can I be doing for like the next generation of the church to be successful. So I think that's a good point. Any other thoughts on David's life or the verses we discussed here? Yeah.
Well, David really communicated a lot with God, psalms and singing and harp, and he really trusted God. And even though Saul was after him, he trusted God in everything that he did. So he kind of laid the groundwork as to how to be a leader, but yet still listen to God at the same time.
Yeah, and I think like it can be easy, especially today, but this has been true throughout history, to feel like that those things have to be at odds, right? Like for you to get ahead as a leader, out in the world, that you have to like do certain things, or maybe cheat people, or like try to get people to like work really hard. I don't know. There's a slew of different things that we've probably all dealt with in jobs that we've had, where we've had managers who might, or CEOs or whatever level, that like probably don't handle things exactly like they should, whether it's greed or whatever. But that is not how we as Christians have to live our lives as leaders to get ahead. Sometimes that might mean that we don't get the promotion, or we don't, things don't work out exactly like we expect. But if we trust God and do what we're supposed to, like we see that David tried to do, right? We're going to make mistakes just like David. And that's why I really appreciate David in the Bible, is like, this would be really hard if he was just perfect, right? He was just like a king that made no mistakes. And it's like, well, I can't live up to that. But we all know we're going to make mistakes. And so this example that David gives us of somebody who has a repentant heart, that when he realizes he makes a mistake, he feels bad about it, he makes changes to turn away from that mistake. That's how we're supposed to be, as Christians and as leaders, and wherever we are leaders in life. So I think that's a good point. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
And I know we mentioned killing Goliath, but that was the first in a long series of David giving like some serious beatdowns to God's enemies.
Yeah.
So he left the kingdom in a much more secure state than he found it in, and they kind of coalesced around, that they pushed back some of those enemies. So when Solomon takes over, there are really no enemies like the Philistines that were always encroaching and raiding. And so for the economic growth that happened under Solomon, they had to have the danger put away from when David.
And I mean, like, we've seen that in like the U.S. history, right? Like, as far as like different presidents and what they focus on, and like you can look at that throughout history as well, of exactly what Baxter's talking about there, where like certain leaders have to focus on the problem at hand, and you might like be able to take care of some stuff on the side, but like if you're constantly at war, the things you're focused on are going to be much different than if you're at a time of peace, right? Like at a time of war, you're probably not going to be as focused on like building stability as you are raising an army and like how are we going to fight these people, right? But like it doesn't make as much sense to have like a ginormous army and everybody be trained to be military if you're not fighting anyone, right? So like I think there's some leadership aspects that come in because of that. So I think that's a really good point as well. And that helps you like, because if David's whole life from the time he was young, it's like, I had to kill Goliath, I have to go and do these things, and like, you're going to focus more on conquest and things like that, right? But like Solomon being brought up like he was, can focus on some of the other things, and he isn't as like trained to think about just conquest and things like that too. I mean, he would have experienced some of it, but like his focus in life is different as well. So, and I think that's like where it helps to have a lot of different perspectives even in the church, not on like matters of like truth, but like we've all lived different lives, and so we can bring those perspectives together so that we can have empathy, for people and love everyone in our community. So I think those are all good points. Any other last thoughts before we move on? Yeah?
He's the only king that, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he's the only king that when he does something, he says, I have sinned.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't point at anybody. I think that's one main leadership quality we need to learn, is to accept when we're wrong rather than, and I mean, we'll all make mistakes. And I think at the end of it's very comforting to me is that, when God says he's not going to build a temple, Solomon is going to build, usually we will be like, well, I'm not going to do anything,
Right.
But he didn't sulk and he didn't do anything. He prepared everything,
Yeah.
That's what we can also learn, that, even though we're not completely, because he's the king, but he's not given what he wanted, he didn't let it affect, but he still did everything to prepare. And that's another thing we need to learn, to work for the Lord and not get mad because it's not going my way.
Right, and I think that's that's a really good point, because that will very likely happen in all of our lives where we think this is our plan, this is what I want to accomplish, and I really want to do this thing, but it may not be for me to do that said thing, and I have to be okay with somebody else being able to do that. And that can manifest in a lot of different ways. It can be generational, like we're talking about here, but it can even be like, if I'm used to, if I'm like, man, I just love removing the snow out there, and like Baxter doesn't do it as good as me, so I'm not gonna, let him take over and help out with that. Like that can also be a thing where we have to be very careful of like, sometimes we have to like give up responsibilities that we might either like or we feel like we do it the right way and nobody else does, but we have to give other people opportunity to be able to do that as well. So I think that's a good point. And then kind of the first thing you said was really good too, as far as like we from here on, the statistics of like good kings versus bad kings, even just in general, not great for Israel, but especially like we don't really have anybody else that like is that great at like pointing out their own mistakes. And I think it's easy for us, even just in places where not leadership roles, to not want to like admit that we've made a mistake. But I think especially in leadership roles, there's like this fear that if people that you're leading see you make a mistake, that they won't listen to you anymore, they won't trust you. But oftentimes if you like own up to it and say, here's what we're going to do to correct this going forward, people respect you more. But you have to like get over that thought that like people just look at you as somebody who never makes mistakes. I think that's a really good point too. Any other thoughts before we keep going? Yeah.
Just a quick comment on that first paragraph. Not a lot of us have the chance to sit down with our children before we die and say, this is what's important to me.
Yeah.
And these are my hopes and dreams for you. This is what's important to our family. But David had the ability, and he was blessed with that opportunity. And doing some work with Grace Hospice years ago, I learned about the ethical will. I know we've talked about that here on and off through the years. A will is passing along stuff. An ethical will is when we sit down and write a document where we share like spiritual values and our ethics with our children. And there's a value to doing that.
Yeah.
And, I think we see that David did in Solomon.
Right, and I think there's like, because there's like two levels to that even, right? Like the first thing you mentioned just made me think of like how we're not guaranteed how much time we have left on this earth. So we can't wait and like assume we're going to have a moment like David to be like, here's all these things that you need to make sure that you handle. And so that to me really makes me think about the fact that I need to like be living my life every day in such a way that like I'm preparing those around me for, me not being here, especially if it's my kids, but even just like responsibilities that I have. So I think that's, something to definitely keep in mind as we're living our lives, that you're not guaranteed tomorrow, so you can't wait to take care of these things. And then as far as like, I think even if you've done all those things and you've prepared your kids, there's value, like Baxter was saying, in the like concept of an ethical will, like writing those things down, because when you lose someone, whether it's expected or unexpected, a lot of times you're emotional and like your head may not be on straight or whatever, and so it's helpful to have all of, like we just experienced this last week, and like trying to go through like planning the funeral and stuff. Like if you don't have stuff written down when you're trying to like go through and do all of these things, like it's very difficult because you're like in an emotional state. So I'm sure like David telling Solomon this right before he passes on is very helpful to have it in the forefront of his mind, and he's got this list of things that he needs to make sure that he's acting on, even though he may be feeling grief or whatever. So I think that's a really good point. All right, let's read, if somebody can do, this is a slightly longer one, but verses 13 through 25 of chapter 2. That's the last passage we'll cover today, verses 13 through 25.
Now Adonijah the son of Haggith came to Bathsheba and the mother of Solomon, and she said, "Do you come peacefully?" And he said, "Peacefully." Then he said, "I have something to say to you." And she said, "Speak." So he said, "You know that the kingdom was mine, and that all Israel expected me to be king. However, the kingdom has turned about and become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. Now I'm making one request of you, do not refuse me." And she said to him, "Speak." Then he said, "Please speak to Solomon the king, for he will not refuse you, that he may give me Abishag the Shunammite as wife." Bathsheba said, "Very well, I will speak to the king for you." So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him for Adonijah, and the king rose to meet her, bowed before her, and sat on his throne. Then he had a throne set for the king's mother, and she sat on his right. Then she said, "I'm making one small request of you, do not refuse me." And the king said to her, Ask my mother, for I will not refuse you." So she said, "Let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as a wife." King Solomon answered and said to his mother, "And why are you asking Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him also the kingdom, for he is my older brother, even for him, for Abiathar the priest, and for Joab the son of Zeruiah." Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, "May God do so to me and more also, if Adonijah has not spoken this word against his own life. Now therefore, as the Lord lives, who has established me and set me on the throne of David my father, and who has made me a house as he promised, surely Adonijah shall be put to death today." So King Solomon sent Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and he fell on him so that he died.
All right, thank you. So at first glance, it's like, what's the big deal about this request, right? Like it's like, okay, he feels like he's been wronged and treated unfairly. Adonijah feels like he can go to Bathsheba and request this. But who is Abishag? Do we remember? I don't know if you all covered that part last week, but does anybody know who Abishag is? Or we can turn back and read it.
David when he's older.
Yeah, so in First King, you're exactly right. In 1 Kings 1, if you just turn back a page or chapter in your Bible, I'll read verses 1 through 3. And it says, "Now King David was old and advanced in his years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. Therefore his servants said to him, let a young woman be sought for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king and be in his service. Let her lie in your arms, that my lord the king may be warm. So they sought for a beautiful woman throughout all the territory of Israel, and found Abishag the Shunammite, and brought her to the king. And so then, she served him in that way, which I'm not even going to touch the interesting thing of how they chose to keep him warm, but but she was, as far as everything that I studied and read through, like, there was no, like, intense relationship between them, right? Like, she was there with him in his old age, and kind of what the Bible says there. But, it would have been Adonijah again. I said things were stable, but this is probably him making a play on, like, hey, I'm going to circumvent this power transfer because Abishag is David's, and then her becoming my wife would mean that, like, David's handing his power to me instead of Solomon. So we see this whole, like, thing of Adonijah being sneaky. So how does he go about this? If somebody wants to summarize for me, does he go to Solomon directly to ask about this? How does he try to make this happen? He goes to mom, right? And he's like, oh, if I go talk to her, then maybe she'll be able to convince Solomon, or maybe we'll, lose some things in translation here, and I'll get what I want. But that's not what happens. And I think this is, like, something that, like, is different than, who knows what David would have done, right? But, like, I feel like Solomon's just like, no, I'm not going to put up with this, and, like, has him put to death, whereas, like, David might have been like, well, let's consider how we want to handle this situation, and, like, maybe we can work something out. But Solomon's just like, I'm tired of all this family turmoil. Like, we're going to get down to business and get it done. And so I think that's, like, an interesting contrast between the two of them, but it's probably on the front of Solomon's mind that he's like, at least right now, he's like, I don't want all this family turmoil, and so I'm going to focus on, like, taking care of problems immediately as they come up, so I don't build up this big list of things that need to be taken care of years and years down the road. So I thought that was, like, a very interesting passage, towards the end of our study today, of how Solomon handled that, and how I think it sets an example for us of, like, there's definitely a balance when you take over as a new leader of, like, you don't want to just, like, come in and change everything for the sake of changing everything just to make your mark, but you also don't have to be afraid of, like, doing the things that you should, that you're supposed to, even if it does make a mark, or, like, people might talk about why you did what you did or whatever, because not everybody's going to understand all the reasons for why you did what you did. And, like, that's why I mentioned that this was kind of subtle, right? Like, if you don't know who Abishag was, you're like, why is this such a big deal as far as this request goes? But
there was the symbolism in taking the man's concubine,
yeah,
wife, or whatever, and so they'd already experienced that. It wasn't Absalom that had taken the concubines.
Right.
That had to be part of Solomon's thinking, saying, no, this can't happen.
Yeah, and, like, that's a really good point that I didn't even mention. It's like he's seen this exact play out of the playbook happen before, and the trouble that it's caused, and so, like, he's wanting to cut that off immediately. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Like you said, I don't want all this family problem, so I'll go marry 700 women.
We'll get to that. He has a really strong start, and then he has some problems after that. But yeah, we're focused on the good start today. Yeah. Any other thoughts about Solomon's start as king? All right, if not, I think we're close enough that I'll close us out with a word of prayer if you want to bow with me. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing us the time to study your word today. Help us to take the passage that we looked at today and apply it to our lives. Help us to be good leaders when we have the chance to be leaders, but also accept when you have other things that you want us to do in our lives, and to help those who are in leadership positions by supporting them, and also just being content with what you ask us to do in our lives. Help us as we move on to our worship service this morning, to worship you in spirit and in truth. Help us to worship you with our hearts and to do everything that you want us to do. In Jesus' name, amen.